Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the outsourcing of manufacturing from the West, which includes not only the United States but parts of Western Europe as well, particularly Britain, and outsourcing manufacturing or just relocating, in fact, manufacturing offshore to primarily China. And this was a process that began sort of really, seriously took off in the early 1990s and continues up until this day. Now, there's a few things worth sort of looking at there, which feed into how we calculate Chinese economic growth and to what extent the initial intentions and purposes behind this relocation of manufacturing to China, whether the objectives were met or partially met, and what was the collateral damage and the fallout. Now, the original thing, once the communist sort of system fell over, which is say in the Soviet Union fell over and disintegrated, and therefore Eastern Europe also, communism ended in Eastern Europe in the sort of the 1990 to 1991 period. And also countries that really had been under the communist sort of orbit as, if you like, a secondary level sort of places in, all over Africa and elsewhere. These places were suddenly, these areas around the globe, they suddenly sort of had no sponsor because the powerful Soviet Union was really no longer able to back them or support them or protect them militarily or subsidize them to the point where they didn't need to do business with the capitalist West. Now, China was already sort of experimenting with a new sort of economic system where they would have a single party state with Marxist overall principles, but they would have a private sector, the capitalist in many ways, but that all the juicy jobs and the juicy profits and the monopolies and oligopolies would all be held by Communist Party goons and hacks. So it was a sort of a capitalist crony economy embedded within a communist governmental control, social control system. And so it was something sort of fairly new. I suppose, given the precise nature of how it was structured, and some of that being a little vague at first, and really the Chinese government themselves trying to find and fine-tune how it was to work and to what extent the party would control things or not, and what freedoms would be permitted or prevented, and so on and so forth. I remember Chinese people coming to Australia in the 90s or later 90s and into the early 2000s. And I remember a lady wanted to buy a newspaper at the shop, just a normal daily newspaper, and like at the newsagent, and she asked where was the government agency she would have to register with before buying the newspaper. And because in China at the time, I don't know what it's like now, but in China at the time, if you wanted to buy a newspaper, you had to register your name and address and so on. And any reading material literally they had to know who you were and what you were reading. And I think we're getting that way in the West now. The level of globalist control they want really requires that level of citizens, surveillance of citizens. So I think we're getting that way now. Any tyrannical regime that wants to control its citizenry, what they hear, what they see, what they say, what they think, has to pretty much have that same structure of intimidation and tyrannical surveillance and so on. So it's no different whether it's used by the Chinese or by the Soviets or the East Europeans, or indeed the globalists in America and the West today. That tyrannical structure will stay the same. But coming to the this manufacturing now, the decision was made in the West, and it was I assume it would have been a G7, G20 type decision, World Economic Forum type decision that was made without the consent of the Western citizenry to transfer manufacturing to China, particularly the more labour-intensive type manufacturing, and where the hourly rates of labour were a relevant factor in the cost inputs. So the decision was made to do that, and so vast swathes of American manufacturing and British and plenty of Australian manufacturing too was sent offshore to China, and this was the intention wasn't per se to relocate manufacturing. That in isolation wasn't the intention. The intention was that if you looked at the growth trajectory China was on in the very low base, it was an agricultural society, had a very low base of industrialization in the overall scheme of things, and it was looked at it would take China 50 to 70 years to actually even become a middle level economy, and therefore their ability to participate in terms of not only production but primarily consumption of first world goods, their ability to participate at that level in the world economy would be minimal, given how slow it would take them on their own, because they couldn't produce high quality goods, so no one was going to buy their shit. They could do it cheaply, but it was crap, and they just couldn't do it. And because they couldn't make the money, they then couldn't consume Western goods and services to any appreciable extent. So there was two positions. One was, we have to bring the Chinese economy up to a mid-level economy, and we have to do it quickly. How do we do that? Well, let's just transfer Western jobs. So we'll just steal the jobs, take the jobs away from the Western workers, and we'll give it to China. Because they've got a much lower mechanization rate and a low cost of labor in a factory that might employ, for example, 1,000 people in, say, the United States, because of the high level of mechanization, if that factory relocated to China, it could be 10 or 15,000 people get a job, because it's all manual. There's no machines to do anything, or hardly any. So those were the view, and the view was that this would make China a much richer country in a much shorter space of time, and therefore they would change their political system and become much more like the West and integrate economically, at least, with the West. And all these 1.45 billion consumers would all come streaming into the world market to buy Western goods and services. Now, that was the starry-eyed notion. I mean, the reality was quite different, and they should have known that then. And I've spoken back in the day to some quite senior American businessmen, and I kept telling them, look, don't think you've got 1.5 billion consumers there, apart from the fact that more than half of those are either old or their children. The majority of the people in China are still farmers and peasants living out in the rural areas. They're not cashed up executives looking to buy all the latest in Western goods. Some are, but nowhere near the number you think there is. But that was sort of just shrugged off. I don't care. 1.5 billion consumers. They'd all go into a swoon and they'd get rock hard as they sort of dreamed of all these people all buying, brand new motor vehicles and so on. So, but the reality was far from different. The amount of people that had that consumption power in China at the time was maybe 20 million, something like that, and nearly all of those would be party hacks and goons in this crony economy that the party was building. There's no point in having lots of wealth if the people who you most rely on to control the rest of the population aren't sharing disproportionately in that wealth. So the idea was that you gather all the goons and hacks around you, all the influencers and the controllers of the rest of the population. You make sure they become very rich, and then everybody's happy. Your mechanism and devices of control remain intact, and you've got technically at least a capitalist economy. So or a profit motivated economy. So anyway, the jobs were all so many factories were transported over to China. Now, the problem was that the quality of the materials declined, the quality of the workmanship declined, and the finished product was of a lesser quality, and then it was sent back to the American consumer. Now, sure, just using round numbers, a T-shirt that was $10, was now $5 that you got from China. The profit that the American owner of the brand name, their profit was the same or better, because they had they were just paying an outsourced contract to give me 1 million T-shirts and we'll pay this. So it was a per unit thing rather than having to pay workers and all the administrative staff that would go with it. So they might beef up the sales in America. They might beef up the sales and marketing staff and so on. But even there, the salaries that were paid to the junior girlies that they bring into the marketing department and so on, weren't the same salaries as when they had the manufacturing and all the infrastructure in the West. So they sent all these jobs offshore, but they got a lower quality product in return. And simple things like a T-shirt that was $10 may last you 5 years. You can wash it plenty of times. Whereas now the $5 T-shirt lasts 1 year or one summer. So when you look at, you've got to replace that T-shirt 5 times over 5 years. You've had to spend $25 rather than the $10 for the higher quality Western made T-shirt. There are sweatshirts that I bought in Texas, made in Texas in the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of thing. And I tell you, give them a wash, and they're still in. I mean, I don't wear them every day, for goodness sakes, but they're still in good condition. I mean, you try and do that to something that was made in China. So the quality went seriously downhill, and it's a false economy that you have to replace something so often that by the time you've replaced it as often as you have to meet the same life expectancy of the other article of clothing, you've actually spent more. So the Western consumer was just buying inferior goods at a cheaper price, but thought they had to replace more often. So I don't think the consumer, in many areas, there was some, but in many areas didn't benefit. In some areas, so I don't think the consumer, in many areas, there was some, but in many areas didn't benefit. In some areas, say some of the electronic goods, the TVs, some of those things, the quality of those is not so bad. I don't think it's as good as it once was. The refrigerators, again, I don't think the quality is good, but it has improved since those early days. But the price of the improved quality goods is now starting to approach the same price as if it was made in a Western country. So I'm struggling to see the benefit there. But how did the Chinese do this? Keep the wages low for a long time, where instead of having machines and factory automation, that sort of thing, they would just have thousands of people sitting at benches, with soldering irons or putting pins in things and with sewing machines and, that sort of stuff, where the level of mechanization was incredibly low by Western standards. So because China was an agrarian economy, most of the people were, and there's many still there, are illiterate, rural farming peasants living hand to mouth and living in a barter type situation, where the guy that grows a bit of a surplus of rice exchanges it for I don't know, cotton fabric from the guy down the road, exchanges his stuff for food or so, so they're living very much a subsistence hand to mouth barter economy. Now, when a big or a large agricultural sector lives that way, they don't exist from an economic statistician's point of view. Those subsistence farmers and people who are bartering, they have no cash purchasing power, hardly any. So they economically, they just don't exist. It's almost as the economic statistician looks out into the huge farmland area. There's nobody there. There's nothing there. Economically, there's nothing there. There's lots of people, but from an economic statistician's point of view, nobody there even exists. Now, you move that person, that barter subsistence farmer, from the farm into the city and sit him at a a factory or in an assembly plant where he hand stitches something or solder irons something. Suddenly he does exist economically. So the Chinese economic growth didn't come from actual economic growth as we would understand it. Firstly, they were starting almost at floor level anyway, but because they moved 200 million people from the country to the cities or the urban areas, and that's how big the population. When you can move that many people from the country to the city, then suddenly these 200 million people who didn't even exist statistically beforehand, suddenly they do exist. And when 200 million workers appear just in what's a very condensed time frame, like it was in, well, not even 20 years. So that suddenly appears, well, look at China's economic growth. Wow, holy fuck, oh, gee whiz. But it actually wasn't economic growth as we would understand it. It was a moving of people from an unrecorded economic sort of statistical place to suddenly being recorded. And this gave the artificial illusion of economic growth. So anyway, so China, the Chinese rate of labour was 1/15th to 1/20th, depending on sort of where you were. 1/15th to 1/20th of what the labour rate for the US was. And I was talking to people, certainly in those early days when it was all new and exciting in the eyes of some at least. And they were saying that the cost of labour in China is so low, and there are so few laws, controlling things like pollution and there's hardly any labour laws and this sort of thing, and they can work these people 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They can put them, 6 or 8 to a room in bunk beds, all this sort of stuff. Feed them out of communal canteens and the like, and these people, they're able, $1 an hour, for example, they're able to run a complete factory without a single machine in it, because the cost of labour is so low. It's even more expensive to automate for efficiency than it is to have all this cheap labour just sitting, shoulder to shoulder doing donkey work to make something. And this was the same in places like India where labour's cheap as well, or indeed other places in the world. I've seen places getting built in third world countries where they've got masses of unemployed labour, and was watching a truck turned up with bricks to make some building, and there's no conveyor belts or wheelbarrows or any, even the most basic sort of tools that we would like shovels or anything like that. There were so many people there. They stood shoulder to shoulder, and they were so tightly packed they could barely pass the bricks. So they made this human chain, passing the bricks to one another to get the bricks over to where the building was being done. And if they were mixing, concrete and cement, that sort of thing, it was done with just sort of random pieces of corrugated metal or pieces of wood or their bare hands. And so there's barely any what we would call basic implements, like shovels and wheelbarrows and this sort of stuff. And because there's so much labour there, somebody can just stand next to the mixing of the cement with a hose and hose it over, or it wasn't even a hose actually, just they get a bucket of water from the well and splash some on every moment or two. And so this is how things, and this is how the manufacturing worked in China at the beginning, just because there's so much labour and the cost of it was so cheap that even putting a machine in wasn't worth it. That's changed a bit now, and the Chinese manufacturing, like all manufacturing anywhere, they want to move up the value chain and that sort of stuff. Wages are supposed to be now, maybe a third of what they were, instead of being a 15th to a 20th of what a Western wage would be in China. Now supposed to be a third of what the Western wages are. So it's still cheaper there from a labour perspective, at least in many ways. But if you compare it, say, to the cost of labour in other countries now, like some countries in South America, certainly Mexico as an example, then the labor rate in Mexico is cheaper than it is in China, although political and social stability is less, I think, in Mexico, or given the given the drug cartel activity. So what's the future of manufacturing? I don't think the West wants manufacturing jobs in the West, but there's a tipping point where the majority of people in the West will be non-white and will be peasants from the third world, and I think this will create an enticing situation for the globalist elites to relocate manufacturing back to the West and have low wage, given there's potential for so much low wage labour, and have manufacturing jobs returned. So I would see some shifts starting to occur there. But I don't think the Chinese experiment has run its course yet. But there's a few things that haven't happened. Firstly, the Chinese aren't integrating with the world economy, and certainly have very independent notions of what the role that the Chinese want to play in world geopolitics. So in a political terms, and in many ways in economic terms, this whole starry-eyed notion of integrating China into the world economy, and that they would take more open views of that hasn't come to pass. Some of this is because the globalists are particularly using things like homosexuality, LGBTQ, transgenderism, feminism, race hustling, and that sort of thing to try and crush and demoralize the white people all across the West. Now, the Chinese government, certainly if I was there, would be looking at things, gee, well, we don't want that. We don't mind taking Western money, but we don't want their values and attitudes being exported to us. They can send us their jobs and their money, but we don't want anything else. So that's very limited the Western penetration of China in cultural terms, at least. So I see the Chinese, running or having a very independent course for themselves culturally, and not surprising, by the way. I mean, I could have told the globalists that years ago. But China also sees itself as the middle kingdom in the center of the universe, and as it once was, and it sees that's its rightful place. Now, I don't think they want to necessarily invade everybody and all that sort of stuff. I mean, they can do that through exporting their populations anyway, if they want to. But that aside, I don't think they want to actually directly invade and control other parts of the world. But they do want respect, and the kowtowing sort of concept of respect, where the inferior one sort of gets on their knees and bangs their head on the stonework. That's something that's very much ingrained to Chinese psyche, and they want to see that level of respect. So we won't invade you, but you damn well prostrate yourself in front of us and remind yourself that you're inferior and we're superior, and we do demand and expect that. And we'll punish you for not showing enough respect. So this respect thing is going to be, I think, the center of the basis of all future conflict. The Taiwan thing isn't necessarily about Taiwan, but this idea that wherever the Chinese diaspora has gone to, whether it's thousands of years ago or whatever, that is the territorial limits of Greater China, if you will. And this is going to take in various parts of Asia as well as, of course, Taiwan. So denying China that right to for its the wider extent of diaspora, that's seen as disrespect. You will respect us. We'll make you respect us. And if you don't, we will damn well fucking make you not only respect us, but beg to be in our good graces. And I see that as the future, and that will certainly affect the where and how manufacturing is conducted around the world. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.